Peace to you, my friends. Recently, I purchased some fenders or mud guards for my bicycle so that I can ride it in inclement weather and not get dirty from all the water and mud that tends to spray out from the tires. I purchased a set from a German company because why not, right? German engineering. Everything they do mechanically is always precise, beautiful, and works exceptionally well. This past week, I finally had the opportunity to put them on. And if you happened to pass by the rectory garage this past week and thought that you heard some passionate words coming from the garage, it was not your imagination, it was me. Although there were only 15 screws that I needed to insert in the various places on my bike, it took me almost 6 hours to accomplish the task. The instructions were not helpful at all. In just a few sentences, the instructions told me what I needed to accomplish, but they failed to tell me how to get there. As every bicycle is different, it couldn't tell me where exactly or how exactly everything needed to come together on my particular bike. So the first hour was pretty much spent in the garage looking up YouTube videos for better instructions. And while I didn't find any videos of someone putting fenders on the exact same bike as mine, every video that I found took only about 10 or 15 minutes long. So I thought, this can't be too hard. Well, things didn't line up exactly. According to the instructions and videos, screw holes for mounting the fenders were supposed to be found on the outside of the bike, but mine were on the inside. So I was really confused and couldn't figure out what went where. I would try one thing and then get frustrated and then leave everything for about an hour so that I can cool off and clear my head. A while later, after I thought I had figured it out, with confidence I would head down to the garage to give it another go, only to abandon the project after 30 minutes and attempt again after some time had passed by. Finally, 6 hours later, after pulling out all the pieces from the box, after countless YouTube videos that didn't help, after many failed attempts, after one brief pouting session on the garage floor, I finally was able to install the fenders successfully. They worked perfectly. And yes, just the other day, after we had some rain, I took my bike out for a test ride, and like a little child, I purposely hit every puddle. I'm happy they're on my bike, as they will allow me to use my bike much further into the fall season. But why, oh why, could not the instructions have been more clear? Isn't that always the case with some assembly required? A scholar of the law asked Jesus, "Teacher, which commandment of the law is the greatest?" Jesus knew that he was being tested. And as we've seen before, he was not about to fall into another trap, but instead ensnared the scholar in his limited understanding of the law. For on a whole other level, the scholar was looking for a strict and clear interpretation of the 613 laws that govern every minute aspect of daily life. We heard just a few of them in today's first reading from Deuteronomy. In the scholar's question, which commandment in the law is the greatest, we can perhaps hear a sense of being overwhelmed with being faithful to all 613 laws, and maybe a desire for an easier way out. A desire for what is the absolute minimum that one must do in order to still be faithful. A desire for clarity. Tell me what to do. Give it to me in black and white. And Jesus' response is masterful. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. In his response, Jesus accomplished 4 things. Number 1, he avoided the trap. Number 2, he correctly highlighted the 2 commandments as being the basis for all 613 commandments. Number 3, he gave the scholar the clarity of what to do. So you can imagine the scholar's response or reaction to these words. Assuredly, he knew that he was not successful in his attempt to trap Jesus. But at the very least, he had the clarity. He had it all in black and white until he realized the fourth thing that Jesus did, which was to create more questions for the scholar. You shall love the Lord your God. Well, how does one exactly go about doing just that, loving God? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, then who is my neighbor? In the end, what the scholar and we discover is this: that the only black and white that exists in the world of God is that we are loved by God, and that the only appropriate response to God's love is to love as God loves and to love our neighbor. Yes, there are absolute or objective moral truths. But we're not talking about moral truths here. We're talking about the love of God. And while we might think that the world of black and white is the way to go, the reality is that we often stray into gray areas. We might like to think that there are some gray areas with the loving the neighbor part, which could give us perhaps some wiggle room so that we can get out of loving him or her because we really don't like them, or get out of some sense of responsibility towards the poor, refugees, migrants, elderly, and marginalized because it's not our responsibility, it's not our job. To do so, we would be fooling ourselves. To love God as God loves means there is no wiggle room or gray areas when it comes to loving our neighbor. If God loves the poor, the refugee, the immigrant, elderly, and marginalized, and he does, then we too must love them as God does. This assuredly is black and white. In less than 2 weeks, our country will hold its elections, and I would imagine that we will all breathe a sigh of relief when it's all over. Because one of the most stressful aspects of any election is the arguments that are had on all sides as to what one issue is the most important issue facing our country. Not unlike the scholars who often love to debate which is the most important of the 613 commandments, we also take pleasure in friendly debates on what is the most important issue facing our country. There's nothing wrong with that. Unfortunately, as we have often seen, regardless of what party we might belong to, there is a tendency on some to take these debates beyond friendly forums into forums of intimidation and misinformation. Even more unfortunate, some go so far as to say that if you are a true patriot, this is the way you should vote. Or, if you are a true Catholic, you can never vote for that person. Sadly, these attempts only further divide our country, and worse still, they violate the sanctity of our conscience. No person can ever tell us how to vote, how to act, how to live our lives. The church is very clear on that the ultimate arbiter on all these questions is our individual consciences. Well-formed consciences, mind you, but our own consciences nonetheless. To do so otherwise is to violate the sanctity. Also, no election can ever be about one single issue. No candidate, platform, or political party can ever have everything solved and in black and white. Again, the only black and white that exists is that we are loved by God. And the only appropriate response to God's love is to love as God loves and to love our neighbor. How exactly we go about loving God and neighbor? How exactly will we live our lives? How will we vote? That is the work of a well-formed conscience, which does take much time to form correctly. After many repeated failures and corrections, and occasionally a pouting session or two on the garage floor. Especially when we realize that despite all desires to the contrary, there are no shortcuts or one size fits all. Some assembly is required.